I'm Greg Garbus of Four Season Tools. We're going to talk about laying out V-track for movable tunnels. Here we're building a stationary plant house and 3 V-track movable tunnels. There's 2 3-position 30 by 48 movable tunnels, and in the middle we have a 2-position 30 by 96. When laying out the V-track, it's important that we butt all the tracks up. So the first thing we did was we measured our plots, measured the length of the tunnels. We have to make sure that you keep track of your overlaps and your gaps. At the end of the V-track installation chapter, there's a reference chart that talks about exactly how many track pieces and all the dimensions you need. So behind me we have a 3-position 30 by 48. It has a 3-foot overlap, 48 feet for the first position, a 6-foot gap, 48 feet for the second position, a 6-foot gap, and 48 feet for the third position, and a 3-foot overlap. So a 3-position 30 by 48 actually has 162 feet of track. Once we found our ends of our 162 feet, we made sure that our track was laid out so that the peak of the track, from the peak of the track, was 3.5 inches in on each side from the total width of the tunnel. So in this scenario with a 30-foot wide tunnel, our V-track is at 29 feet 5 inches. Once we had our points that were correct on our length, we measured our diagonals to make sure everything was square. There was professional site preparation done here and making sure we had a nice compacted track pad and swales on the outside of the tracks for all sorts of drainage. We then used a tractor, loaded up our V-track, came out here and butted it up end for end to get it all the way along the length. In that V-track reference chart, it talks about where the different anchor points are. Sometimes the anchor points end up at the seams, and sometimes they end up in the center of the V-track. These V-track connectors are put in each point in between the 2 V-track sections. There's 4 bolts that put them in. When the anchor point ends up at a V-track plate, we replace one of the mounting bolts, one of the carriage bolts that mounts them together, with a forged eye bolt. In this scenario, the first anchor point ends up right in the center of the track, so we put our forged eye bolt right at that point. If you have sidewall doors in your movable tunnels, it's important to move your anchor points 6 feet into the tunnel so they don't interfere with the sidewall doors. It's also important when you're laying down V-track that there's a slot right in the center of every 12-foot section, that slot ends up on the inside of the tunnel, so the anchor points end up on the inside of the tunnel. Once we have all of our V-track laid out, we know where it's going to go, we bolt it all together. We flip it upside down. It's easier to put the carriage bolts in and come down on it with an impact from the top. We use a 9/16 impact socket because they're 3/8-inch bolts. They're carriage bolts and they fit into the slot so that they don't rotate, so you don't need a wrench on the opposite side. When we tighten it all up, we make sure one person is headed down, is watching along the line to make sure as we bolt it together, we're keeping the track straight. After everything's bolted together, all of our anchor points are in the right place. Again, they'll end up on the inside of the tunnel. What we do is we lift it up and we put it on top of these little shims. Putting it on top of these blocks makes it a lot easier to flip the tunnel, or to flip the track. We make sure that our track is exactly where we want it along the length, because once we flip it, it's a lot more complicated to move it because the heads of the bolts do dig into the ground. After we flip the track, we get it all in place. We again continue to measure our 29 feet 5 inches from peak to peak. We continue to measure the square, make sure everything is laid out where we want it. The next step, after it's exactly where we want it, perfectly flat, we eyeball down the entire track. We move it a little bit just to make sure it's in a perfect straight line. We then use these rebar tees, these T-anchors, and we put them in. The ones on the inside of the tunnel face out, and the ones on the outside of the tunnels face in. It's that cross anchoring that really gives us the most pull out for the track and make sure that the tunnel is anchored properly. The V-track is the track is anchored to the ground and the tunnel is anchored to the track. So it's very important that our track is anchored properly. Once those are all in, we'll pound them in, and that's exactly how you put the V-track in.